Hello and welcome. Today, we're not just taking a stroll through history, we're subjecting ourselves hypothetically to one of its most formidable, most demanding, and frankly, most brutal societies. We're talking about ancient Sparta. You've heard the legends, haven't you? The 300 at Thermopylae, Leonidas, the laconic wit, Malon Labe, come and get them. It all sounds incredibly heroic, incredibly cool, and from a safe, modern distance, it is. But have you ever seriously considered what it would take to be a Spartan? Not just for a battle, but for a lifetime. Or, as our title suggests, even for a single solitary day. Let's be honest. Most of us, myself included, enjoy our comforts. Our warm beds, our varied diets, our personal freedoms, our smartphones, our ability to express dissent without immediate, painful repercussions. Sparta, my friends, had none of these. Not in any way you or I would recognize. So steel yourselves. We're about to dissect why you, yes you, with all your modern sensibilities, your expectations of comfort, your deeply ingrained individualism, and your likely aversion to institutionalized brutality, wouldn't last a single 24-hour cycle in the heart of Lace Demon. This isn't about judging them by our standards entirely. It's about understanding how utterly alien their world was and how profoundly ill-equipped we are for it. Let's begin at the very beginning, shall we? Because your Spartan day wouldn't start with a gentle alarm or the smell of coffee. It would start before you were even truly conscious of your own existence. Part 1. The moment of birth, the first test you'd fail. Imagine this, you're born, a tiny, helpless infant. In most societies, ancient or modern, this is a moment of joy, of celebration. In Sparta, it was your first and arguably most critical examination. You wouldn't be swaddled and cooed over immediately. Oh no. You, as a newborn Spartiate, would be taken by your father not to your mother's loving embrace just yet, but to the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. These men, hardened veterans, community leaders, would inspect you, and I don't mean a cursory glance. They'd examine you for any sign of physical deformity, weakness, or any perceived imperfection. Was the baby small? Did it seem sickly? Was there anything at all, that suggested this child would not grow into a perfect specimen of Spartan warriorhood if male, or a robust mother of future warriors if female? If you passed, congratulations. You were deemed fit to live, fit to consume Spartan resources. You'd be returned to your family. But what if you didn't? What if you had a clubfoot, a visible birthmark deemed unsightly, or were simply considered too frail? There was no neonatal intensive care unit. There was no compassionate understanding of genetic diversity. There was the apothete, the deposits, a chasm, a pit near Mount Taygetus. Unfit infants were left there, exposed, to die. So right there at hour zero, many of us, with our modern genetic lottery that includes things like asthma, poor eyesight requiring glasses from a young age, or even just being a bit scrawny at birth, would have failed. Our day in Sparta would have ended before it even began, a short, brutal footnote. Can you imagine the sheer emotional detachment required from parents? The state came first, always, the quality of the collective over the individual life. Let's assume, for the sake of this thought experiment, you're a perfect baby. You pass the inspection. Phew, what now? A life of comfort and coddling. Think again. Even Spartan mothers, renowned for their strength, were not encouraged to be overly sentimental in a way that might soften the child. The goal was to produce toughness from the crib. No rocking to sleep if you cried too much. You'd be taught, through harsh experience, that fussing got you nowhere. You'd be bathed in wine, not water, under the belief it would toughen your skin or reveal epileptic tendencies. True or not, it certainly wouldn't be a pleasant spa experience for a newborn. So you've survived birth, the inspection, and the wine bath. You're maybe a few hours old. You haven't even made it to lunchtime on your first day of existence, and already the pressure is immense, the standards unforgiving. Would you, as that infant, already be exhibiting the kind of quiet stoicism expected? Probably not. Most modern babies are champion criers, and for good reason. In Sparta, that might already be a black mark. Part 2, Childhood. Welcome to the Agoge. If you're a boy, let's fast forward. You've somehow made it to age 7. If you're a girl, your path is different, and we'll touch on that. But if you're a boy, this is a momentous and terrifying turning point. This is when you leave your family, completely. At age 7, you are handed over to the state. You enter the Agoge, the famously brutal Spartan upbringing system. Forget your mother's cooking, forget your father's guidance, forget playing with your siblings in the comfort of your home. Your home is now a barracks. Your family is now your age group, your bois or herd. Your masters are older boys and state-appointed trainers, the paid nomos and his assistants, armed with whips, and they are not your friends. Think about your own 7-year-old self or any 7-year-old you know, still needing comfort, reassurance, a hug when they fall, easily scared, reliant on adults for almost everything. Now, imagine that child thrust into a world where emotion is weakness, comfort is non-existent, and pain is a daily lesson. Your first day in the Agoge. What would it entail? Firstly, the clothes. You'd be given one garment, a simple tunic, the himation, and that's for the entire year. Hot summer, freezing winter, one garment. You think you'd be cold. You're supposed to be. It builds endurance. Shoes, forget them. Spartans went barefoot, always. Again, to toughen the feet, to make you agile too. Ensure you could traverse any terrain. Imagine your soft, modern feet, used to cushioned sneakers, suddenly forced onto rough, stony ground, thorns, hot sand, icy mud. By the end of day one, your feet would be shredded, bleeding, and incredibly painful. Complaining, that would earn you a beating. Sympathy, non-existent. Food, food, the fuel that keeps us going. In the Agoge, you were deliberately, systematically underfed. The famous Spartan black broth melas zomos, a delightful concoction of boiled pig's blood, pork, salt, and vinegar. Even other Greeks, who were no strangers to simple fare, found it disgusting. Plutarch tells a story of a Sybarite, a man from a city known for luxury, who tried it and said he then understood why Spartans were so willing to die. The rationale for underfeeding? Several. It was thought to make boys taller, a dubious theory. It accustomed them to hunger, useful on campaign, and most importantly, it encouraged them to steal. Yes, you heard that right. Stealing food was not only permitted but actively encouraged. It taught cunning, resourcefulness, and stealth. However, and this is a very Spartan however, if you got caught stealing, you were punished severely. Not for the stealing itself, but for the incompetence of being caught. So, on your first day, hungry, cold, your feet screaming, you'd be eyeing any scrap of food, but the older boys, the trainers, they're watching. They know the game. Your attempts at thievery would likely be clumsy, obvious, and the punishment. A flogging, immediate, painful, and humiliating. Think about the psychological impact. You're actively encouraged to break a moral code, don't steal, that's fundamental in most societies, but then punished for doing it badly. It's a constant state of high-stakes tension. Then there's the discipline. Oh, the discipline. Spartans were obsessed with obedience and order eunomia. The Agoge was designed to beat individuality out of you and forge you into a cog in the Spartan war machine. Any perceived infraction, talking back or talking too much, remember laconic, not performing a drill correctly, showing fear, showing excessive emotion would result in a beating. These weren't light taps. These were serious, painful beatings, often administered by older boys who themselves had been through it and were now eager to assert their dominance. It was a culture of institutionalized bullying, designed to weed out the weak and enforce conformity. How would your modern sense of justice, your expectation of fair treatment, cope with that? You'd be bewildered, outraged, and then very, very sore. What about learning? Surely there was some schooling. Yes, but not as you know it. Reading and writing were taught, but only to a basic, functional level. The real curriculum was physical education, military drills, pain endurance, and the Spartan ethos. You'd learn war songs, tales of Spartan heroes, and the laws of Lycurgus, their semi-mythical lawgiver. Intellectual curiosity beyond what served the state was not encouraged. No philosophy as in Athens, no complex mathematics, no art for art's sake. Imagine the sheer exhaustion by the end of your first day in the Agoge. Physically battered, emotionally drained though you wouldn't dare show it, starving, cold, and terrified. Your bed, a pile of reeds you gathered yourself from the Eurotas River. No mattress, no pillow, no blanket. In winter, you might be allowed to add thistledown for a little, very little insulation. And sleep. Would you even be able to sleep with the hunger pangs, the cold, the aches, and the fear of what tomorrow might bring? Or the fear of an older boy deciding to test you in the middle of the night? The environment was intensely homosocial, and while sources are debated, pederastic relationships between older youths and younger boys were likely a component of the Agoge, framed as a form of mentorship and military bonding. For a modern child, this would be utterly confusing and potentially terrifying, regardless of how it was culturally contextualized. So, for any boy entering the Agoge, the first day would be a brutal shock to the system. You'd be stripped of your identity, your comfort, your family, and subjected to a regime designed to break you down and rebuild you as a Spartan. Most modern 7 to 12-year-olds, the Agoge continued in stages, would be traumatized. You wouldn't last the day. You'd be a sobbing, shivering wreck, probably trying to run away, which would only lead to more severe punishment. Part 3, Life for a Spartan Girl Different, but still no picnic now. What if you were born a Spartan girl? You wouldn't go to the Agoge, but don't imagine a life of leisure and pampering. Spartan women were unique in the Greek world. They had more freedom, more agency, and a much greater emphasis on physical fitness than their Athenian or Corinthian counterparts. Why? Because the primary role of a Spartan woman was to produce strong Spartan warriors. Strong mothers, it was believed, produced strong children. So, from a young age, Spartan girls also underwent physical training. They ran, wrestled, threw the discus and javelin, perhaps even drove chariots. They participated in public processions and competitions, sometimes nude or scantily clad, just like the boys. This would have been scandalous to other Greeks, but for Spartans, it was about promoting health, strength, and a kind of eugenic pride. So on your day as a young Spartan girl, you might find yourself engaged in rigorous exercise. No sitting inside doing needlepoint all day, though they did learn domestic skills. You'd be out in the sun, building your physique. This might appeal to some modern athletic girls, but remember the context. It wasn't for fun or personal achievement. It was your duty to the state. Spartan girls also received some education. They learned music, dance, and poetry, the traditional Doric paeans and choral songs. This was to make them good participants in religious festivals and to instill Spartan values. But again, the focus was on communal well-being and producing citizens who understood and upheld the Spartan system. While they weren't subjected to the same daily brutality as the boys in the Agoge, the pressure was still immense. The shame of not being physically fit, or later, of not producing healthy children, would have been considerable. And while they had more freedom, they were still utterly beholden to the state's expectations. Their bodies were, in a very real sense, property of the state, vessels for the next generation of warriors. Imagine the conversations. Your mother wouldn't be saying, "Follow your dreams, dear." She'd be saying, "Be strong so you can bear strong sons for Sparta." The famous Spartan maternal exhortation, "Return with your shield or on it," given to sons going off to war, encapsulates this mindset. There was no room for a mother who prioritized her son's survival over Sparta's honor. Could you, as a modern mother, or even as a daughter internalizing those expectations, truly embrace that? So, while a girl's first day adjusting to the Spartan way might be less physically punishing than a boy's entry into the Agoge, the psychological weight of expectation, the singular focus on childbearing and physical prowess for that purpose, would be a heavy burden for anyone raised with modern ideas of self-determination and a broader range of life choices. Part 4, the adult Spartiate male, a life of constant vigilance and duty. Okay, let's say you've somehow survived the Agoge. You've endured years of hardship, emerged tough, disciplined, and utterly indoctrinated. You're now a Spartiate, a full citizen soldier, perhaps in your early 20s. You've made it right, now life gets easier. Wrong. In many ways it gets harder, or at least the responsibilities become even more acute. Your entire adult life until age 60 is dedicated to military service and readiness. A typical day for an adult Spartiate: wake up early, no lie-ins. The day starts with training, drills, weapons practice, physical conditioning. You are a professional soldier in a state that is perpetually, if not at war, then preparing for it. Your skills must be honed, your body a weapon. This isn't a 9-to-5 job with weekends off. This is your life, every single day. Think about your modern fitness routine. Maybe you hit the gym a few times a week. Maybe you go for a run. Could you handle hours of intense, military-grade training day in, day out for decades, with no off-season, with the constant pressure to be at peak physical condition because your life and the life of your comrades literally depends on it? Then there's the syssisha, the common mess hall. This was compulsory for all Spartiate men. You didn't eat at home with your wife and children, at least not regularly, especially when younger. You ate with your military comrades, your tent mates. This fostered incredible bonds, the famous Spartan esprit de corps. But it also meant constant scrutiny. Each member had to contribute a set amount of barley, wine, cheese, figs, and a small sum for meat or fish from his own estate, his kleros, worked by helots. If you failed to make your contribution, perhaps due to a poor harvest or mismanagement, you could lose your citizenship. Imagine that pressure. Not just social embarrassment, but actual loss of status and rights. The food, as we've mentioned, was famously austere. That black broth was a staple. Portions were adequate but not lavish. This wasn't about gourmet dining, it was about sustenance and discipline. Could you face that meal day after day, year after year? No ordering takeout if you don't like what's on offer. And the conversation. It wouldn't be idle chit-chat about the latest sports scores unless those sports were Spartan competitions or celebrity gossip. It would be about state affairs, military matters, and often testing the younger men with probing questions and expecting witty, laconic answers. Failure to be sharp or saying something foolish would lead to ridicule. It was a constant intellectual sparring match designed to keep everyone on their toes. No room for quiet introverts who just want to eat their meal in peace. Privacy. What privacy? You lived and trained and ate with your comrades. Even marriage was strange by our standards. Men often married in their 20s, but continued to live in the barracks until they were 30. They would sneak out at night to visit their wives, an act that was supposed to keep the passion alive and also, perhaps, demonstrate stealth. But imagine the lack of a normal family life, the clandestine nature of early marriage. And then there's the ever-present helot situation. The helots were the subjugated Messenian and Laconian populations, essentially state-owned serfs who worked the land for the Spartiates. They outnumbered the Spartans significantly, possibly by as much as 7 or 10 to 1. This created a permanent state of underlying fear and oppression. The Spartans lived in constant dread of a helot uprising. Much of their social structure, their militarism, their brutality, was designed to keep the helots terrorized and controlled. One of the most infamous institutions was the crypteia. Young Spartiates, often those deemed most promising, would be sent out into the countryside, armed with daggers, to live off the land and essentially terrorize the helot population by stealthily assassinating any helot who seemed strong, rebellious, or simply unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Plutarch describes it as a declaration of war on the helots each year, so that killing them was not a crime. Can you imagine participating in that? On your day as a young Spartiate, you might be tasked with joining the crypteia. Could you, raised with modern ethics and empathy, sneak through the darkness and murder an unarmed peasant simply because your state commanded it, because they were deemed a potential threat? This is one of the darkest aspects of Spartan society, and one that most modern individuals would find utterly repugnant and morally impossible. Even if you weren't in the crypteia, your daily life would involve managing your kleros, which meant managing your helots. This required a constant assertion of dominance, a readiness to use force, and a complete dehumanization of the people whose labor fed you and allowed you your life of military training. Could you maintain that level of detached cruelty? And if there was a helot revolt, or a war with another Greek state? You'd be on the front lines, no question. And the expectation was simple: victory or death. Cowardice was the ultimate sin. A Spartan who fled in battle, a tresses, lost all rights, was shunned, humiliated. Men would not exercise with him, girls would not marry him, he would have to wear patched cloaks and shave half his beard as a mark of shame. His life would be a living hell. The pressure to conform, to be brave, to die rather than retreat, was immense. So, your day as an adult Spartiate, brutal training, an unappetizing communal meal under constant scrutiny, the moral burden of overseeing an enslaved population or actively terrorizing them, and the ever-present expectation of unflinching obedience and readiness to die for the state. All personal ambition, all individual desire had to be sublimated to the collective. There was no me in Sparta, only we, and we meant the Spartiate elite, built on a foundation of fear and servitude. Could you handle even one day of that? The physical demands alone would crush most. But add the psychological and moral demands, the lack of freedom, the constant surveillance, the brutal purpose underpinning it all. I think not. Part 5, what about the luxuries and freedoms? There weren't many. You might be thinking, okay, it sounds tough, but surely there were some upsides, some fun. Let's talk about Spartan fun. Their entertainment consisted of athletic competitions, hunting, choral performances of patriotic songs, and war dances like the Pirhich. There were religious festivals, which were important communal events, but these were all, again, tied to the state, to military preparedness, to reinforcing Spartan values. No great theaters like in Athens, producing profound tragedies and comedies that explored the human condition. The Spartans were suspicious of too much intellectualism, of ideas that might challenge their rigid order. No flourishing schools of philosophy debating the meaning of life. Life's meaning in Sparta was simple: serve Sparta. No vibrant marketplaces filled with exotic goods from across the Mediterranean. Spartans practiced a form of xenophobia, xenolasia, periodically expelling foreigners and discouraging Spartans from traveling abroad, lest they be corrupted by foreign ideas or luxurious habits. Their currency was famously made of iron spits, obloi bulky and of little intrinsic value, precisely to discourage the accumulation of wealth and trade. So, on your day in Sparta, what would you do for leisure? You couldn't browse the internet, watch a movie, read a novel, go shopping for anything other than the absolute basics, if you were even allowed to shop for yourself. You couldn't engage in a passionate debate about politics unless it towed the party line. Your options were limited and all pointed back towards the state. Personal expression, forget it. Your clothing was uniform, your haircut was probably prescribed, your speech was expected to be laconic, brief, and to the point. Expressing doubt, fear, or unconventional opinions was not just frowned upon, it was dangerous. What about love and relationships? We've touched on marriage, it was primarily for procreation. While deep bonds undoubtedly formed, the romantic ideals we often hold, the idea of marrying purely for love and building a cozy domestic life, were secondary to the needs of the state. Plutarch even mentions that wife sharing, with the consent of the husband, for the purpose of producing strong offspring if a husband was old and his wife still young and fertile, was acceptable. How would that sit with modern notions of marriage and fidelity, even something as simple as choosing your career? In Sparta, if you were a Spartiate male, your career was chosen for you, soldier. There were no other paths. No artists, no merchants in the traditional sense, no full-time scholars except perhaps those who codified the laws. Your life was preordained. The very things that many of us cherish: freedom of choice, freedom of expression, the pursuit of individual happiness, comfort, intellectual exploration, a diverse and stimulating cultural life were either non-existent or actively suppressed in Sparta. Imagine trying to explain your hobbies to a Spartan. So, in my free time, I like to watch fictional stories on a glowing box, or I enjoy collecting rare stamps, or I write poetry about my inner turmoil. They would look at you with utter bewilderment, perhaps contempt. How does this serve Sparta? How does this make you a better warrior, a stronger mother? Their entire worldview was predicated on the survival and dominance of their polis, their city-state. Everything else was a distraction, or worse, a weakness. Part 6. A moment-by-moment breakdown of your failed Spartan day. Let's try to walk through your hypothetical 24 hours in Sparta, assuming you're an adult male Spartiate, as this is often the focus of the Spartan legend. 0500 a.m. or earlier, you're jolted awake. Not by a gentle alarm, but probably by a horn or a superior officer kicking your reed bed. It's cold. The floor is cold. Your single garment doesn't offer much warmth. You're already stiff and sore from yesterday's training or from sleeping on hard reeds. Modern you hits snooze, pulls the duvet tighter, groans, already failing. 0530 a.m. 0800 a.m. Training. This isn't a light jog. This is grueling. Running in rough terrain barefoot, wrestling, javelin and discus throwing, mock hoplite combat. You're pushed to your absolute limit. Any sign of weakness, slacking, or complaining earns you a sharp word, or more likely, a blow from a trainer's staff. Modern you, after 20 minutes, you're gasping for air, muscles screaming, feet bleeding. You're probably thinking about your rights, about how this is abusive. You might even try to argue. Big mistake. 0800 a.m. Morning ablutions. A quick dip in the cold Eurotas River. No hot showers, no fancy soaps. Modern you, shivering uncontrollably, wondering where the towels are, and the deodorant. 0830 a.m. Sisisha breakfast. If you even get a dedicated breakfast, it might just be a hunk of barley bread. Or perhaps your first taste of the infamous black broth. It's an acquired taste, which you haven't acquired, and won't. Modern you, politely or not so politely, declines the broth. Asks if there's a fruit option or perhaps some coffee. You're met with stares of contempt. You're still starving from being deliberately underfed in your youth, and this isn't helping. 0900 AM 1200 PM, more training or state duties. Perhaps weapons maintenance. More drills, or if you're older, attending the appella, the citizen assembly if it's convened, or fulfilling some other civic role. Everything is serious. Everything is for the state. There's a constant tension in the air, the awareness of the helot threat, the need for constant vigilance. Modern you, your mind is wandering. You're bored by the repetitive drills. You miss your phone. You're wondering what's happening on social media. You try to make small talk, maybe a joke. It falls flat. You're told to be quiet and focus. Your laconic wit isn't witty enough, or it's too verbose. 1200 PM 0100 PM, Sisisha main meal. More black broth, perhaps some pork, barley, figs, cheese, watered-down wine. The portions are measured. The conversation is still guarded, testing. You're expected to contribute, but you have nothing of Spartan value to say. Modern you, you're picking at your food. You're probably feeling sick from a combination of exertion, hunger, and unpalatable food. You miss spices, you miss variety, you miss choosing what you eat. You might make a face, someone notices. You're reprimanded for your lack of discipline. 0100 PM 0500 PM, afternoon activities. Could be more training. Could be hunting, a practical skill for warriors. Could be overseeing helots on your kleros. If it's the latter, you're confronted with the brutal reality of Spartan society. You see the fear in the helot's eyes. You're expected to be harsh, to command, to perhaps even punish. Modern you, you're horrified by the treatment of the helots. You feel an overwhelming sense of injustice. You might even try to be kind to a helot. This would be seen as weakness, a dangerous sentimentality. Your fellow Spartans would view you with suspicion. You're not one of them. 0500 PM 0700 PM, evening training or leisure. Leisure might mean more athletic contests. Or listening to war songs. There's no winding down with a good book or a favorite TV show. The intensity doesn't really drop. Modern you, you're physically and emotionally exhausted. You crave solitude, peace, and quiet. None are forthcoming. You're surrounded by hard men in a hard society. 0700 PM 0800 PM, Sisisha evening meal, similar to the midday meal. More communal eating, more scrutiny. By now, you're probably a complete wreck. Modern you, you can barely choke down the food. You're probably silent, overwhelmed. Your silence might be misinterpreted as sullenness or disobedience. 0800 PM onwards, barracks life. If you're under 30, you're back in the barracks, no privacy, just your fellow soldiers. The talk is of war, of duty, of Spartan glory. Perhaps some grim jokes, or perhaps an older youth decides to toughen you up further. Modern you, you're desperate for this day to end. You're aching all over. You're hungry. You're psychologically battered. You miss your family, your friends, your comfortable bed, your freedom. You probably feel utterly alone despite being constantly surrounded. Bedtime, you collapse onto your pile of reeds. Sleep is unlikely to come easily. Your mind is reeling from the culture shock, the brutality, the sheer alienness of it all. And you know with dawning horror that tomorrow will be exactly the same, and the day after, and the day after that. For the next 40 years, would you have made it through that first day without breaking down? Without crying out for mercy or comfort, without instinctively rebelling against the injustice and the harshness, without your body giving out from the unaccustomed physical demands and poor nutrition by modern standards of variety and appeal. I submit that by lunchtime on day one, most of us would be looking for the nearest exit, which, of course, wouldn't exist. By dinner, we'd be considered a catastrophic failure, a drain on resources, an embarrassment. We might even be punished for our manifest unsuitability for Spartan life. Part 7. The psychological price of being Spartan. We've focused a lot on the physical, but the psychological toll is just as important to consider when asking why we wouldn't last. Spartans were conditioned from birth to suppress individual emotion in favor of communal duty and stoic endurance. Fear, grief, beyond a certain restrained point, excessive joy, all were suspect. This doesn't mean they didn't feel these things. It means they were relentlessly trained not to show them, and perhaps, to some extent, to master or channel them. Think about your own emotional landscape. We're encouraged to be in touch with our feelings, to express them, to seek help if we're struggling. In Sparta, struggling was a sign of weakness. Therapy, unthinkable. A Spartan's therapy was more training, more discipline. The constant surveillance, first by trainers, then by peers in the Syssitia, then by the state itself, would be anathema to anyone raised in a society that values privacy and individual autonomy. Imagine every action, every word, being weighed and judged against a rigid code of conduct. It would be suffocating. The moral compromises, particularly concerning the Helots, would be unbearable for many modern people. To participate, actively or passively, in a system of brutal oppression, to live a life of relative privilege built directly on the suffering of others, and to be told this is not only necessary but just, that's a heavy psychological burden. Spartans were indoctrinated to accept it. We are generally indoctrinated with ideals of human rights and equality. The clash would be immediate and irreconcilable. The lack of intellectual freedom, the suspicion of new ideas, the absence of art and philosophy as we know it, would leave many of us feeling starved. Our minds, accustomed to a constant stream of information, debate, and creative expression, would chafe under such constraints. And the ever-present threat of death in battle, not just as a possibility but as a glorified ideal. We value life. We strive to preserve it. Spartans valued an honorable death for the state almost as much, if not more, than life itself. That fundamental difference in valuing existence would create a chasm of understanding. The Spartan mind was a fortress, built to withstand pain, doubt, and external influence. Our minds, by contrast, are often more like open gardens, receptive to new seeds, new ideas, valuing growth and diversity. You simply cannot transplant one into the other and expect it to thrive. Part 8. Even the good parts would be hard, one might argue, but what about the camaraderie, the sense of belonging, the physical prowess? Yes, Spartans had an incredible bond with their fellow soldiers. The Syssitia and lifelong military service forged unbreakable ties, but this was a bond born of shared hardship and a singular, narrow purpose. It wasn't a bond of diverse individuals choosing to come together. It was a bond of conformity, enforced from childhood. Could you find your place in such a homogeneous, demanding group if your core identity, your values, your very way of thinking were alien to it? You'd likely be an outsider, no matter how hard you tried. Physical prowess. Spartans were undoubtedly supreme athletes and warriors, but at what cost? Their bodies were tools for the state. There was little room for pursuing physical activity for joy, for personal health in the holistic sense we understand it, or for self-expression. It was functional, brutal, and always tied to military effectiveness. And the famous Spartan courage, it was legendary. But it was also a product of intense conditioning, a fear of shame greater than the fear of death, and a lifetime of being told there was no other honorable option. It wasn't necessarily the thoughtful courage of conviction we might admire today. It was often the ingrained, almost reflexive courage of a system that permitted no alternative. Even the laconic wit, which we find amusing in historical anecdotes, was part of this. It was a tool of social cohesion, a way to demonstrate Spartan mental toughness and disdain for wasted words. It wasn't about being genuinely witty in a free-flowing, creative sense. It was about conforming to an expected mode of speech. Try being a chatterbox in Sparta. See how long you last. The very things that defined Spartans' strength, their discipline, their endurance, their martial focus, their collectivism, are the very things that would make it impossible for most modern individuals, raised on ideals of freedom, comfort, and self-determination, to survive. Part 9. The Spartan Woman's Day, a different kind of unbearable. Let's briefly revisit the Spartan woman, now as an adult. She's married, likely to a man chosen for his suitability as a warrior and father, not necessarily for love. She runs the household and the kleros, the estate, because her husband is almost always away with the army or in the Syssitia. This gave Spartan women a degree of economic power and independence unknown to other Greek women. Sounds good, right? More agency. Yes, but consider the pressures. Her primary value to the state is still as a mother of warriors. If she fails to conceive or bears sickly children or worse, only daughters in a society that prized sons for the phalanx, she would face immense social shame. Her famous quote, "Come back with your shield or on it," reflects a mindset where her son's life is secondary to his honor and Sparta's glory. Could a modern mother truly, deep in her heart, send her son to war with that sentiment as her primary feeling? The grief, the fear, the desperate hope for his safe return that would consume a modern parent would have to be ruthlessly suppressed, or at least hidden, in Sparta. She would manage helots too. She would be mistress of a household built on their forced labor. She would have to be strong, capable, and unsentimental. Her freedoms were not for her own self-actualization, but to better serve the state by producing and raising its next generation and managing its resources. So, a day in the life of a Spartan woman, overseeing a large estate and its enslaved workforce, worrying about her status as a mother, instilling Spartan values in her children. Missing her husband, perhaps, but accepting his primary duty is to the state, not to her. Always projecting strength, always embodying Spartan ideals. No room for perceived weakness or excessive emotion. Again, a different kind of challenge than the men faced, but no less demanding, and requiring a mindset profoundly alien to most modern women who expect to define their own purpose, their own families, their own lives. Part 10, Specific Modern Habits and Why They'd Get You Killed or at least beaten. Let's get really specific. Think about your daily habits. 1. Checking your phone, the first thing you reach for. In Sparta, what phone? That constant need for connection, for information, for entertainment. It would be seen as a massive distraction, a weakness. You'd be twitching within an hour. 2. Expressing your opinion freely, you post your thoughts on social media, debate with friends, maybe even protest. In Sparta, your opinion was only valuable if it aligned with the state. Dissent was not tolerated. Your first, well, actually, I think, on a matter of state policy could be your last. 3. Comfort eating, stressed, sad, bored, reach for a snack. In Sparta, food was fuel and scarce fuel at that. Emotional eating wasn't a concept. Complaining about the black broth would be met with disgust. 4. Needing me time. We all need to decompress, to have some solitude. In Sparta, solitude was suspect. You were part of the collective. Me time would be seen as shirking your duty, as not being a team player. 5. Valuing comfort and hygiene, your soft bed, your hot shower, your clean clothes, your climate-controlled environment. None of that existed. You'd be perpetually uncomfortable, probably smelly by our standards, and either too hot or too cold, and complaining about it, weakness. 6. Questioning authority. Why do I have to do this? That doesn't seem fair. These are normal modern responses to orders we don't understand or agree with. In Sparta, obedience was absolute and unquestioning. Questioning an order from a superior, a trainer, an elder, that would earn you a swift, painful lesson in Spartan discipline. 7. Aversion to pain and violence. We generally try to avoid pain. We find violence abhorrent unless in self-defense. In Sparta, pain was a tool of education. Violence was a part of life, from the Agoge to the Crypteia to the battlefield. Your modern squeamishness, your empathy for those suffering would be a severe handicap. 8. Expectation of healthcare. You get sick, you see a doctor. You break a bone, it's set and cast. In Sparta, medical knowledge was rudimentary. And again, weakness was not tolerated. If you were chronically ill or seriously injured and couldn't recover to be a functional warrior, your value plummeted. Remember the apothete for infants. That mindset didn't entirely disappear for adults. 9. Career ambitions beyond the military/motherhood. Want to be an artist, a scientist, an entrepreneur, a philosopher? Tough luck in Sparta. Your path was set. For men, warrior. For women, mother of warriors. Any ambition outside that narrow scope was irrelevant. 10. Our concept of justice. We expect due process, fair trials, human rights. Spartan justice was swift, often brutal, and entirely focused on maintaining the Spartan system. The helots had no rights. Even Spartiates could be punished severely and summarily for perceived infractions. Your cry of "that's not fair" would fall on deaf ears. Every single one of these ingrained modern habits, expectations, and values would not just make you uncomfortable in Sparta, they would make you a liability. They would mark you out as different, as weak, as unsuitable. And Sparta had little patience for the unsuitable. Conclusion: a world we are not built for. So, could you last a day in ancient Sparta? Let's be brutally honest. Probably not. Not even a few hours if we're talking about a real, immersive experience from birth or entry into the Agoge, or even as an adult suddenly thrust into that society. We are products of our time, just as the Spartans were products of theirs. Our values, our expectations, our very physical beings are shaped by a world of relative peace, plenty, and personal freedom. Sparta was forged in a crucible of constant threat, scarcity, and an iron will to not only survive but dominate, through the absolute sublimation of the individual to the state. It's easy to romanticize the Spartans. their discipline, their courage, their laconic coolness. But that romance wilts when confronted with the daily reality of their existence, the institutionalized brutality, the oppression of the helots, the crushing conformity, the narrowness of intellectual and personal life, the sheer physical hardship. They were, in many ways, a remarkable people. They created a unique and enduring society that achieved its aims military dominance in their region for centuries through an astonishing, terrifyingly effective system of social engineering. But it came at a price few, if any, modern individuals would be willing or able to pay. The next time you hear a tale of Spartan bravery or someone quotes a laconic Spartan phrase, remember the world that forged those warriors. Remember the Agoge. Remember the Sisisha. Remember the Crypteia. Remember the constant, unyielding pressure to be nothing less and nothing more than a perfect cog in the Spartan machine. And then, perhaps, be grateful for your comfortable bed, your varied food, your freedom to think and speak and choose your own path. Because by Spartan standards, we are all incredibly, wonderfully, hopelessly soft. And in their world, softness did not survive the day. Okay, we've journeyed through the initial, brutal shock of what a day in ancient Sparta might entail. We've seen how, from the moment of birth through the Agoge into adult military life, and even considering the unique roles of Spartan women, the demands are so profoundly alien to our modern sensibilities that survival, let alone thriving, seems an impossible prospect. The lack of comfort, the relentless training, the oppressive social controls, the moral quandaries, it's a formidable list. But let's assume, for a moment, you've somehow, miraculously, gritted your teeth through that first hypothetical day. You haven't broken down. You haven't been flogged into insensibility or ostracized for your manifest unspartanness. What then? Does it get easier? Or do new layers of this deeply foreign society reveal themselves, each presenting fresh, insurmountable challenges for the modern soul? I propose the latter, because the fabric of Spartan life was woven with threads that go even deeper than the daily routines we've discussed. Let's pull on some of those threads. Part 11, the unseen framework, Spartan law and governance, and how you'd break it. You think your local bureaucracy is frustrating. Welcome to Sparta. Their system of governance, attributed to the semi-mythical lawgiver Lycurgus, was complex, unique, and utterly uncompromising. And you, with your modern notions of democracy, rights, and due process, would likely run afoul of it before your second Spartan dawn. First, there were the two kings. Not one, but two from different families, the Agids and Eurypontids. This was intended as a check and balance, but it could also lead to rivalry and paralysis. Imagine trying to understand who's really in charge when there are two hereditary leaders, both with significant religious and military authority. Your modern expectation of a clear chain of command, confusing at best. Then there was the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. 30 members, the two kings, plus 28 men over the age of 60, elected for life. These were the elder statesmen, the guardians of tradition. Getting elected was a peculiar affair. Candidates would walk through the assembly, and the ones who received the loudest shouts of approval were chosen by judges hidden away, unable to see the candidates themselves, only hear the volume. Impartial. Perhaps intimidating for anyone thinking of challenging the status quo, absolutely. Imagine trying to propose a radical new idea, say, maybe we should feed the Agoge boys a bit more, to a council whose entire identity was based on upholding the old ways. You'd be shouted down, literally. But the real power, the one you'd really need to watch out for, lay with the ephors. There were 5 ephors, elected annually from the general Spartiate population. Now, elected from the general population might sound democratic to your modern ears. Don't be fooled. The ephors held immense power. They could arrest and imprison the kings, preside over the Gerousia and the Apella, the citizen assembly, control foreign policy, and exercise judicial power. They were the chief magistrates and, in many ways, the enforcers of Spartan discipline across the entire society. Think of them as a combination of Supreme Court judges, chief executives, and internal affairs investigators, all rolled into one, with very few checks on their immediate power during their year in office. They even had the power to declare war on the helots each year, as we mentioned, legitimizing the Crypteia. Now, how would you interact with this system on your second day? Perhaps you witness an injustice, a helot being abused beyond even the customary Spartan harshness, or a fellow Spartiate being unfairly accused. Your modern instinct might be to speak up, to demand fairness, to appeal to a higher authority. Excuse me, Effer, but that doesn't seem right according to Article 3, subsection B of the Universal Declaration of. You wouldn't even get the sentence out. There was no Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There was Spartan law, designed to preserve Sparta. Your appeal would be seen as insubordination, as questioning the system. What if you were accused of something? Perhaps your performance in training was still woefully inadequate. Perhaps you were overheard muttering something that sounded suspiciously like criticism of the black broth. There wouldn't be a lengthy trial with a defense attorney and a jury of your peers in the way we understand it. Justice would be swift and likely severe, administered by those whose primary interest was maintaining order and discipline. The Effers could and did act as summary judges, and the laws themselves. The Lycurgan Constitution, the Great Retra, was a set of unwritten customs and pronouncements, supposedly divinely inspired. This lack of a codified, easily accessible legal text would be maddening for a modern person used to clearly defined rights and regulations. How do you know if you're breaking a law if it's all based on tradition and the interpretation of the elders and Effers? You'd be constantly walking on eggshells. Think about property. Your kleros, your allotment of land, was inalienable. You couldn't sell it. This was to prevent the concentration of wealth and ensure every Spartiate had the means to support himself and contribute to the syssitia. Sounds good in theory, preventing homelessness among citizens. But what if you were a terrible farmer, or rather, your helots were, under your poor direction? What if you wanted to try a different venture? No flexibility. Your modern desire for economic self-determination to buy, sell, invest, innovate in business, utterly alien. The state decided. And then there's the famous iron money, the obloi, huge, cumbersome iron spits, almost worthless outside of Laconia. This was deliberately designed to discourage the accumulation of private wealth, to prevent luxury, and to make bribery difficult. Imagine trying to buy something substantial. You'd need a cart to carry your cash. While Spartans did eventually succumb to the allure of gold and silver, leading to internal corruption and decline much later in their history. During their classic period, this disdain for conventional wealth was a core tenet. Your modern wallet, with its credit cards and convenient paper money, or even more conveniently, your digital payment apps, represents everything Sparta stood against in terms of personal enrichment and ease of commerce. On day 2, you try to buy a slightly better piece of fruit, if such a thing even exists and is for sale to you with the equivalent of a foreign currency or a promise of future payment. You'd be laughed at, or worse, seen as trying to corrupt the system. The entire legal and governmental framework was designed for one purpose: to maintain eunomia, good order, and the military strength of Sparta. Individual rights, due process as we know it, economic freedom, political dissent, these were not just absent, they were antithetical to the system. You wouldn't just fail to understand it, you'd be a constant irritant to it, a potential threat, simply by dint of your modern expectations. And the Effers had ways of dealing with irritants. Part 12, Faith and Fear Religion in Sparta, and your likely blasphemy. Spartans, like all Greeks, were polytheistic. They worshipped the Olympian pantheon: Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, and the rest. But their religious practices had a distinctly Spartan flavor, deeply intertwined with their military ethos and social order. And your modern secular sensibilities, or even your devout adherence to a different faith, would put you on very dangerous ground. Religion wasn't a private affair in Sparta, it was a matter of state. Piety. Eusebeia was crucial. Omens and prophecies, particularly from the oracle at Delphi, heavily influenced state decisions, including declarations of war. The kings themselves had priestly duties. Festivals were major public events, reinforcing communal identity and seeking the gods' favor for Spartan endeavors. Consider the major festivals, the Gymnopedia, the festival of naked youths. This involved days of dancing and gymnastics by naked men and boys in the searing summer heat, celebrating Spartan military victories and endurance. It was a display of physical prowess and a religious rite. Imagine your modern self-consciousness, your likely unwillingness to participate in such a display, especially under duress. Refusal would be seen as impiety and a rejection of Spartan tradition. The Carneia, sacred to Apollo Carneos, was a 9-day harvest festival with military connotations. During this time, Spartans were forbidden from engaging in warfare. This sounds like a nice break, but it was also a period of intense religious observance. Models of rafts were carried, representing the coming of the Dorians. There were races and musical contests. Your participation, your demeanor, your perceived respect for the rites all would be scrutinized. The Hyacinthia, a 3-day festival at Amyclae, mourned the death of the beautiful youth Hyacinthos, loved by Apollo, and then celebrated his rebirth. The first part was solemn, with mourning, special foods, and a ban on wearing wreaths or singing joyful songs. The second part was celebratory, with processions, sacrifices, feasting, choral song, and dance. This duality of solemnity and joy, strictly prescribed, would require a level of emotional discipline and ritual conformity that many modern people would find stifling. Miss a beat, show the wrong emotion at the wrong time, and you're an outcast. And then there's Artemis Orthia. Her sanctuary was one of the oldest and most important in Sparta, and it was the site of a particularly notorious ritual, the diamastagosis, the ritual flogging of boys. Young Spartan boys would attempt to snatch cheeses from an altar while being whipped, sometimes to the point of death. This wasn't a punishment for wrongdoing, it was a test of endurance, a religious offering to the goddess. The boys were expected to bear it silently. Their mothers would even watch, encouraging them to withstand the pain. Imagine witnessing this. As a modern person, your stomach would churn. Your sense of outrage, your compassion for the children would be overwhelming. If you voiced it, "This is barbaric, stop it," you would be committing a grievous offense. You'd be challenging a sacred tradition, insulting a powerful goddess, and fundamentally misunderstanding, from their perspective, the Spartan need to cultivate extreme toughness. Your horror would be seen as your weakness, your unsuitability for their world. What about your own beliefs? If you're an atheist or agnostic, your lack of belief in the Olympian gods would have to be very carefully concealed. Openly denying the gods would be a capital offense in many parts of ancient Greece, and Sparta, with its emphasis on tradition and divine sanction for its laws, would be no exception. You'd have to go through the motions of sacrifice, prayer, and festival attendance with convincing piety. Could you do it? Could you pretend to believe, day in and day out, in a pantheon and rituals that are utterly foreign to your worldview? If you adhere to a different monotheistic religion, how would you reconcile that with the demands of Spartan paganism? You couldn't exactly say, "Sorry, I can't sacrifice to Zeus, it's against my religion." That would be incomprehensible and dangerous. Even your casual modern speech habits could get you into trouble. Oh my God. God damn it! For Christ's sake, utterances like these, common in modern vernacular, would be deeply shocking and blasphemous in a society where the gods were very real, very powerful, and often capricious. The Spartans lived in a world where divine favor was essential for survival and success. Every aspect of life, from warfare to harvest to childbirth, was under the purview of the gods. Their religion wasn't just a set of beliefs, it was an operational code for navigating a dangerous world. Your modern, often more detached or individualized approach to spirituality, or lack thereof, would be a fundamental mismatch. On day 2, you'd already have committed several acts of unwitting impiety, earning you suspicion and divine and mortal wrath. Part 13, the grind of the hoplite. Beyond the heroism, we picture the Spartan hoplite, bronze cuirassed, helmeted with his distinctive red cloak, long hair, spear, and shield emblazoned with the lambda for lace demon. The image is iconic, heroic. But what was the day-to-day reality of being that warrior, especially when not on an active campaign? It was a grind, and a heavy one, literally. Let's talk about the panoply, the hoplite armor and weaponry. The aspes, the shield, large, round, made of wood covered in bronze, weighing perhaps 20 to 30 pounds, 13 kg. It was designed to protect not only yourself, but also the man to your left in the phalanx. Its loss in battle was the ultimate disgrace because it meant you had broken ranks and endangered your comrades. With your shield or on it, the dory, the spear. 8 to 9 feet long, with an iron spearhead and a bronze butt spike called a sorotor, lizard killer, used for finishing off fallen enemies or as a backup weapon if the spear shaft broke. Constantly practicing with this in formation was key. The xiphos, the short sword, a secondary weapon for close-quarters combat if the spear was lost or broken. The chronos, the helmet. Usually bronze, often of the Corinthian type, which covered the entire head and neck with only small openings for eyes and mouth. It offered great protection but severely restricted vision and hearing. Imagine wearing that for hours in the Greek sun. The thorax, the cuirass or breastplate, initially bronze, later perhaps made of layers of stiffened linen linothorax for better flexibility and less weight, though bronze was still prestigious. It still added significant weight and restricted movement. Greaves, nemides to protect the lower legs. All told, a full hoplite panoply could weigh 50 to 70 pounds, 22-32 kg. Now, imagine training in this. Not just standing around looking impressive, but running, sparring, drilling phalanx maneuvers, shield wall practice, spear thrusts, coordinated movements. For hours, every day. Barefoot, underfed by our standards. On your second day, after a night of poor sleep on reeds, you're kitted out. The sheer weight is oppressive. The helmet is claustrophobic. Your breath rasps inside it. Your vision is tunneled. Sounds are muffled except for your own harsh breathing and the clanking of metal. The cuirass constricts your chest. The shield strains your left arm. And then the drills begin. Synaspismos, the command to lock shields. You have to get it right, perfectly aligned with the men beside you. Too much gap and an enemy spear finds its mark. Too much overlap and you impede your neighbor. Athismos, the push. The phalanx was not just about stabbing, it was about a coordinated, brutal shoving match to break the enemy line. This required immense collective strength and endurance. You, with your modern office worker physique or even your recreational gym fitness, would be a liability. You'd stumble. Your shield would droop. Your spear thrusts would be weak and poorly aimed. You'd be gasping for air long before the seasoned Spartans even broke a sweat. And remember, any failure, any weakness, invited scorn and punishment. There was no good effort, pat on the back. There was only competence or failure. Beyond the physical exertion, consider the psychological aspect of being perpetually ready for such brutal combat. Hoplite warfare was terrifying. Two dense blocks of heavily armed men smashing into each other at close quarters. The noise wore cries, the paean battle hymn, screams of the wounded, the clash of bronze on bronze, the thud of spear on shield. The sights dust, blood, mangled bodies. The fear was immense. Spartans were trained to master it, or at least to function despite it, through relentless drilling and a deeply ingrained fear of shame. Could you, with your modern aversion to violence, your likely lack of experience with genuine life or death physical confrontation, even begin to cope with this mindset? The constant focus on combat, on killing, on enduring pain and an early death if necessary. Even the aesthetics were part of it. Spartans famously wore their hair long. Why? Plutarch says Lycurgus believed it made handsome men more handsome and ugly men more terrifying. It was part of their warrior identity. Your modern short back and sides or your carefully styled do. You'd look out of place, another mark of your otherness, and you wouldn't be asking a Spartan barber for a trim and some product. The red cloaks, the phoenixes, were not just for show. They were said to conceal wounds, both to prevent dismay among comrades and to avoid showing weakness to the enemy. Everything had a practical, grim purpose. So day 2 as a hoplite in training, or a full one if you're older. You are aching, bruised, and psychologically overwhelmed by the sheer brutal functionality of it all. Your romantic notions of Spartan heroism are being ground into the dust of the training field by the relentless, unforgiving reality of what it took to be a Spartan warrior. You're not just failing the drills, you're failing the very essence of Spartan manhood. Part 14, the helot in your head, the moral stain, deeper dive. We've touched on the helots, the enslaved agricultural workforce that underpinned the entire Spartan system. But let's delve deeper into what living with this institution, day in and day out, would do to you, a modern individual presumably raised with ideals of equality and human dignity. On your first day, you were shocked. On your second day, that shock would begin to curdle into a profound moral sickness, or you'd be forced to undergo a terrifying desensitization. Remember, helots outnumbered Spartiates by a significant margin. This wasn't a small, manageable servant class. This was a vast, subjugated population living in a state of perpetual fear and resentment. The Spartans knew this. Their entire society was structured as an internal occupying force. Imagine the daily interactions, or lack thereof. Helots worked your kleros, the land that fed you and allowed you your life of military training. You wouldn't be tilling the fields or harvesting the olives. That was their job. Your job was to ensure they did it, and to ensure they never, ever forgot their place. How would you do that? With kindness and understanding, by offering them fair wages and good working conditions? Absolutely not. That would be seen as dangerously naive, undermining the entire system. You would be expected to be aloof, harsh, demanding, and ready to use or condone violence. Think about the psychological mechanisms involved. To maintain such a system, the oppressors must dehumanize the oppressed. Helots were routinely humiliated. They were forced to wear degrading clothing like dog skin caps, forced to get drunk and behave foolishly as a negative example to young Spartans, and, as we know, subject to the Cryptea's murderous attentions. They were the enemy within. Could you participate in this dehumanization? Could you look a Helot in the eye and see not a fellow human being, but a tool, a threat, something less than yourself? If you couldn't, you'd be incapable of functioning as a Spartiate landowner. Your kleros would fail. You'd fail to meet your Syssitia contributions. You'd lose your citizenship. The system demanded your complicity. What if you tried to be nice? Perhaps you secretly give a Helot child a piece of fruit, or you speak to a Helot worker with a modicum of respect. If witnessed by another Spartan, you'd be reprimanded, possibly punished for undermining discipline. The Helots themselves might be suspicious, fearing a trick or retribution. Your modern empathy would be a dangerous liability for everyone. And then there's the fear. Not just the Helots' fear of Spartans, but the Spartans' fear of Helots. This pervasive paranoia was a constant undercurrent. Every shadow in the night, every unfamiliar noise from the Helot quarters could be a sign of impending revolt. This fear justified the brutality. It fueled the Crypteia. It demanded constant vigilance. Living in that atmosphere of suspicion and dread would be corrosive. Your modern assumption of basic safety and social trust would be shattered. You'd be living in a garrison state, even in peacetime. Consider the earthquake of 464 BC. It devastated Sparta and triggered a massive Helot revolt that lasted for years. It was a fight for Spartan survival. In such a crisis, any lingering sympathy for the Helots would be treason. You would be expected to fight them, kill them, with pitiless resolve. Could you do it? Could you slaughter people whose only crime was a desperate desire for freedom, people you had perhaps seen daily, even if from a position of power? The moral stain of the Helot system is, for many historians and ethicists, the greatest condemnation of Sparta. For you, a modern individual, to be thrust into it would be to face an impossible choice: either become a willing oppressor, deadening your conscience, or be crushed by the system for your inability to conform to its brutal necessities. By the end of day 2, the weight of this reality would be pressing down on you, a suffocating, soul-destroying burden. You wouldn't just be physically uncomfortable, you'd be morally compromised in a way that would haunt you. Part 15. The world beyond Sparta. Xenophobia and isolation. Spartans were not cosmopolitan. They practiced xenolasia, the expulsion of foreigners. This wasn't a constant, hermetic seal, but it was a tool used periodically to prevent the influx of corrupting foreign ideas, luxuries, and habits. They were deeply suspicious of the outside world. Spartans themselves were also discouraged from traveling abroad, especially to more decadent cities like Athens or Corinth, lest they pick up dangerous notions of democracy, philosophy, or comfortable living. How would this affect you, a product of a globalized world, accustomed to cultural exchange, travel, and a constant influx of new information and perspectives? On day 2, you might idly wonder about news from home, your modern home, that is. You might crave a conversation with someone who doesn't think exactly like every other Spartan. You might want to read a foreign book, if you could even find one, and if you could read it without suspicion. These desires, perfectly normal for us, would be deeply un-Spartan. Imagine encountering a trader from Corinth or an envoy from Athens in periods of uneasy peace. Your natural curiosity might lead you to try and engage them in conversation beyond the absolute necessities. What's life like in Athens? I hear your theater is amazing. This kind of interest in foreign ways would be viewed with deep suspicion by your fellow Spartans. Why is he so interested in those soft, chattering Athenians? Is his loyalty wavering? The Spartan mindset was insular. Their way was the only way, the superior way. All other societies were, to varying degrees, degenerate, weak, or undisciplined. This cultural chauvinism was a cornerstone of their identity. Your modern multiculturalism, your appreciation for diversity, Your belief that other cultures have valuable things to offer these would be seen as dangerous weaknesses, a crack in the Spartan armor. What if you possessed some skill or knowledge from your modern life that you thought might be useful? Perhaps a rudimentary understanding of engineering or sanitation or a more efficient farming technique. Trying to introduce such an innovation, especially if it had a foreign flavor or challenged traditional methods, would be an uphill battle. This is not how Lycurgus ordained it. This is not the Spartan way. Progress for Spartans often meant a more perfect adherence to their ancient, established system, not radical change. The lack of intellectual cross-pollination would be stifling. No new philosophies to debate beyond reinforcing Spartan dogma, no challenging artistic movements, no scientific inquiry for its own sake. The mental world of Sparta was, by design, a closed loop. You, with your brain accustomed to the internet, to a torrent of global information, to constant novelty, would feel like you were suffocating in an intellectual desert. And if you, by some miracle, had been allowed into Sparta as a foreigner, a highly unlikely scenario in the classical period unless you were a vital envoy on a very short leash, your experience would be one of constant surveillance and suspicion. You would be the other, the potential spy, the source of corruption. You certainly wouldn't be invited to join a syssitia or observe the Agoge intimately. Your day would be spent in carefully controlled isolation. This xenophobia wasn't just a quaint quirk, it was a deliberate policy to protect the Spartan system from contamination. Your very presence as a modern, globalized individual would be a contaminant. By the end of day 2, your longing for a connection to a wider, more varied world, or your attempts to share your own broader perspective, would have marked you as dangerously un-Spartan, a foreign body to be expelled. Part 16, Sickness, Injury, and Old Age. The Spartan way of decline life in the ancient world was precarious. Disease was rampant, medical knowledge was rudimentary, and injuries could easily become fatal. Sparta was no exception, but their attitude towards sickness and weakness was predictably harsh. Remember the apothete, the chasm for unfit infants. That ethos, that intolerance for physical imperfection, echoed throughout Spartan life. While they wouldn't usually expose sickly adults, the pressure to remain physically robust was immense. On your second day, perhaps you've picked up a nasty cough from sleeping on damp reeds, or maybe one of those training bruises is becoming infected, or you've sprained an ankle on the rough terrain. In your modern life, you'd rest. You'd see a doctor, you'd get antibiotics or pain relief. In Sparta, you'd be expected to tough it out. To show any sign of prolonged weakness was to diminish your value as a warrior. Doctors, iatroi, existed in ancient Greece, but their skills were limited. Spartan medicine would likely have focused on practical, battlefield-type injuries, wound dressing, setting bones if possible. For internal ailments or infections, they had little to offer beyond folk remedies and appeals to the gods. Imagine having a chronic condition, something like asthma or diabetes, or even just consistently poor eyesight that can't be corrected by Spartan means. You would be unable to fulfill your duties as a warrior. What then? You certainly wouldn't be given a desk job in the Spartan administration. You'd become a burden, an object of pity or contempt, and aging. Spartans were liable for military service until age 60. That's a long time to maintain peak physical condition under such a demanding regime. Those who made it to 60 were revered. They could be elected to the Gerousia, becoming guardians of the laws. This was a position of immense honor. But what if your body gave out before then? What if, at 50, you were crippled by arthritis from decades of hard living and training, or your strength simply waned? There was no pension plan, no gentle retirement community. You were expected to remain useful to the state for as long as possible. Think about mental health. We've already discussed the psychological pressures. What if you developed what we would now recognize as PTSD from the horrors of war or the brutality of the Krypteia, or debilitating depression from the oppressive conformity? There was no concept of such illnesses, no sympathy, no treatment. You would be seen as weak-willed, malingering, or perhaps even cursed by the gods. On your second day, any physical ailment beyond the most superficial or any visible sign of mental distress would immediately set you apart. Your modern expectation of medical care, of compassion for the sick, of understanding for mental struggle would find no purchase here. You'd be expected to overcome it through sheer Spartan will. And if you couldn't, you were failing again. Even basic hygiene, as we understand it, was different. The dip in the Eurotas was bracing, but it wasn't a deep clean with antibacterial soap. Sanitation was not a priority. The close living quarters, the common messes, the wounds and exertions of training it was a recipe for infections and disease by modern standards. You, with your immune system accustomed to a more sanitized environment, might be more susceptible. And when you got sick, you'd be on your own in a way that's hard for us to truly comprehend. The Spartan way was to breed for strength and cull weakness. While this was most evident at birth, the principle extended throughout life. If you couldn't keep up, you fell by the wayside. By day 2, your body, unaccustomed and unprepared, would likely be screaming in protest, and the Spartan response would be essentially, get over it or get out of the way. Part 17. When crisis hits Sparta under pressure. We've been discussing a normal day in Sparta. But what about when things went truly wrong? Ancient societies were prone to natural disasters, devastating plagues, and, of course, existential wars. Sparta, despite its strength, was not immune. The Great Earthquake of 464 BC is a prime example. It reportedly killed thousands, leveled much of the city, and crucially, emboldened the Helots to launch a massive, prolonged revolt known as the Third Messenian War. This was a crisis that shook Sparta to its core. Imagine you, a modern person, are in Sparta when such an earthquake hits, the terror of the ground shaking violently beneath your feet, buildings collapsing. The screams of the injured and dying. Your modern instinct for emergency services, for organized disaster relief, for checking on loved ones who, in Sparta, might be scattered or estranged by their societal roles. Where would you turn? The Spartans, no doubt, would react with discipline. The warriors would secure arms, rally, prepare for attack, because their first thought would be the Helots. There would be no FEMA, no Red Cross. It would be raw survival and military response. Could you function in that chaos? Could you, amidst the rubble and aftershocks, immediately shift into a combat footing against a desperate, enraged, servile population? Your modern disaster response training, if you have any, is about saving lives, providing aid. The Spartan response would be about saving Sparta, which meant suppressing the Helots with maximum force. The priorities would be utterly, jarringly different, or consider a plague. The famous plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War devastated that city. While Sparta itself was spared that particular outbreak to the same degree, they were not immune to disease. Imagine a virulent epidemic sweeping through the close, packed barracks in Sicily. No understanding of germ theory, no quarantine protocols as we know them, no effective treatments. People would be dying around you. The fear, the stench, the breakdown of even Spartan order. Could you cope? Their response would likely be a mixture of stoicism, increased religious observances to appease the angered gods, and letting nature take its course. Your modern understanding of contagion and public health would be useless, and your terror palpable, and major wars. The Peloponnesian War against Athens dragged on for nearly 3 decades. It involved long campaigns, sieges, naval battles, for which Spartans were not initially well suited, and periods of intense strain on Spartan manpower and resources. If you were a Spartiate during such a prolonged conflict, your life would be even more relentlessly focused on war. Longer absences from home, even from the barracks if deployed elsewhere, higher chances of death or injury, greater privations. The already harsh Spartan life would be dialed up to an extreme. Your modern desire for peace, for a swift resolution, for a way out. Other than total victory or death, would be seen as defeatism. The pressure to conform, to endure, to contribute to the war effort without question would be absolute, even internal political crises. Though Sparta prided itself on eunomia, it was not immune to conspiracies, power struggles, or periods of instability, especially in its later history, e.g. the reforms and counter-reforms of Agoge's Roman IV and Cleomenes' Roman III. Though that's a bit later than classic Sparta, the potential for internal strife was always there. Being caught on the wrong side of a political purge in Sparta would not lead to a comfortable early retirement. It would likely mean exile or death. Your modern political maneuvering skills, honed in a democratic context, would be of little use in the ruthless, high-stakes game of Spartan internal politics, especially when the ephors held so much power. On day 2, a sudden crisis natural disaster, Helot uprising, outbreak of war would expose your modern frailties in the starkest possible way. You wouldn't have the conditioning, the mindset, or the relevant skills to survive, let alone contribute positively by Spartan standards. You'd be a panicked, ineffective burden. Part 18, the language barrier. More than just laconic, we know Spartans were laconic, meaning they used few words. If you, a king once replied to a lengthy, threatening letter. If, that's the classic example. But the communication challenges would go far deeper than just brevity. On your second day, you're still struggling. You try to ask a question, to explain yourself, to understand an order. Your modern tendency might be to elaborate, to provide context, to use qualifiers. Excuse me, sir, I'm not entirely sure I understand what you mean by secure the eastern perimeter. Could you perhaps elaborate on the specific threats we're anticipating and the rules of engagement? Because in my previous experience, which I understand is not relevant here, but might offer some transferable skills. You'd be cut off with a glare or a barked command to stop talking. Spartan speech was not just brief. It was expected to be pithy, pointed, and often imbued with a dry, sometimes harsh, wit. There was a cultural expectation to get to the heart of the matter immediately. Small talk, idle chatter, lengthy explanations, these were signs of a cluttered mind, of Athenian decadence. But it's not just about the number of words. It's about understanding the unspoken. Every culture has its nuances, its subtexts, its shared understandings that are never explicitly stated. In a closed, traditional society like Sparta, these would be incredibly powerful. How a superior looked at you, the tone of a single word, a gesture, these could convey volumes. And you, the outsider, would miss these cues entirely. You might misinterpret a moment of Spartan dry humor as a genuine insult, or vice versa. You might not pick up on a warning that was subtly conveyed. You might inadvertently offend someone deeply by a turn of phrase or a topic of conversation that is taboo. Think about the Agoge. Boys were encouraged to ask probing questions of their elders in the Syssitia, and elders would test the boys. But these exchanges had unspoken rules. The questions had to be intelligent, the answers sharp and laconic. A foolish question or a rambling answer brought ridicule. You, with your different educational background and communication style, would likely flounder in such an environment. And what about the Doric dialect of Greek that Spartans spoke? While mutually intelligible with Attic Greek spoken in Athens, it had its own peculiarities of accent, vocabulary, and grammar. Even if you had some classical Greek, you'd still struggle with the local vernacular. This would further mark you as an outsider, someone who literally doesn't speak their language. Consider the power of silence in Sparta. Silence could mean approval, disapproval, contemplation, or contempt. How would you interpret it? Your modern unease with prolonged silence in conversation might lead you to babble, to fill the void, a cardinal sin in Lacedaemon. Then there's the performative aspect of language. Spartan public speech, when it occurred in the Apella or from an official, was expected to be weighty and serious. There was little room for rhetorical flourishes or emotional appeals common in other Greek democracies. It was about conveying strength and resolve. Your modern communication style, likely more informal, more expressive, perhaps more reliant on irony or self-deprecation, would simply not compute. By the end of day 2, you'd be tied in linguistic knots. You'd be either too verbose or awkwardly silent, constantly misunderstanding and being misunderstood. Your inability to master the Spartan way of speaking, and more importantly, of thinking that underpinned it, would be a constant source of friction and failure. You'd feel like you were trying to navigate a minefield blindfolded, where every word could be a misstep. Part 19, the absence of progress and individuality, revisited with new depth. We've touched on the Spartan suspicion of new ideas and the sublimation of the individual. But let's consider the profound psychological impact of this on someone from the 21st century, where innovation, personal growth, and self-expression are practically sacred concepts. Sparta's ideal was not a dynamic, evolving future. It was the perfect preservation of the Lycurgan past. Their golden age was behind them in the laws of their founder. The goal was to maintain that idealized state, to resist change, which was almost always seen as decay. You, a modern person, are likely imbued with the idea of progress that societies should strive to improve, to become more just, more prosperous, more knowledgeable. You look for new solutions to old problems. In Sparta, the solution to most problems was a more rigorous application of the existing system. Things are tough, we must be more Spartan. Imagine suggesting a new farming technique that could increase yields from the kleroi. This is not how our fathers farmed. Imagine proposing a different way to educate boys in the Agoge, perhaps one that involved less beating and more positive reinforcement. This is not what made us strong. Imagine trying to introduce a new art form, a new musical style. This is not the music that inspires warriors. Your innovative spirit, your desire to improve things, to experiment, would be seen as a dangerous restlessness, a dissatisfaction with the perfect order. Where you see potential for improvement, they would see a threat to stability. This fundamental difference in outlook would lead to constant frustration and individuality. Modern Western society, for all its flaws, generally celebrates the unique individual. We encourage people to find themselves, to pursue their passions, to express their unique talents and perspectives. In Sparta, your value was as a component of the state. Your self was to be a Spartan, self-disciplined, obedient, courageous, and virtually interchangeable with every other Spartan of your class and gender. Eccentricity, unthinkable. Personal ambition that didn't align with Sparta's ambition, treasonous. A desire to pursue a life path different from the one prescribed, inconceivable. On day 2, you're still you with your unique history, talents, dreams, quirks, and flaws. But Sparta doesn't want you. It wants a blank slate to mold, or a pre-formed Spartan. Your ingrained habits of thought, your personal preferences, your very sense of self as a distinct individual with inherent worth outside your utility to the state, all of this would be under assault. You might try to express your personality through a small gesture, perhaps humming a non-Spartan tune, or trying to make your corner of the barracks slightly more comfortable in a unique way. These small acts of individuality would be noticed and likely suppressed. We are all Spartans here. There is no room for personal indulgence. The pressure to conform would be immense, not just in outward behavior but ideally in inner thought. The goal of the Agoge and the entire Spartan system was to produce citizens who internalized Spartan values so completely that they wouldn't even desire to be different. Could you erase your personality? Could you silence your inner voice that says, "But I want to do this," or "I think that"? The psychological toll of such self-suppression, day after day, would be immense. It would feel like a slow death of the soul. By the end of your second day, you'd be acutely aware that there was no space in this society for the person you are, only for the Spartan they demand you become. And the chasm between those two would seem terrifyingly wide. Part 20. The little things that would drive you mad beyond the grand themes of war, oppression, and social control. Sometimes it's the little, everyday discomforts and deprivations that can break a person. And Sparta was full of them, at least by our standards. Food again, but with more detail. We mentioned the black broth, but imagine the sheer monotony. Barley, some cheese, figs, occasional pork. Very little seasoning beyond salt and vinegar. No sugar as we know it. Honey was a rare luxury. No coffee, no tea, no chocolate, no spices from the East. Your modern palate, accustomed to a vast array of flavors and cuisines, would be in perpetual miserable revolt. You'd dream of pizza, of curry, of a simple bag of chips. The sheer blandness, day after day, would be a form of torture. Comfort, or lack thereof, sleeping on reeds. One garment, barefoot. No padded chairs, no sofas, no soft beds. The constant low-level physical discomfort would grind you down. A splinter in your foot could become a major issue. An insect bite could become infected. You'd be perpetually itchy or cold or hot or sore. Those little creature comforts we take for granted. Their absence would be a constant, nagging irritant. Smells and sanitation. Ancient cities were not fragrant. Lack of sophisticated plumbing, open fires, animal dung, unwashed bodies by modern standards, the smells of the Syssitia, that broth again, blood from sacrifices or training injuries. Your modern nose, accustomed to deodorants, perfumes, and relatively clean air, would be assaulted. Noise, the clang of weapons, the shouts of trainers, the marching feet, the cries from the Agoge, the sometimes raucous Syssitia. But also, perhaps, an unnerving quiet in public if everyone is being laconic. It wouldn't be the diverse soundscape you're used to. Certain sounds would be constant reminders of the harshness of the regime. Lack of entertainment, as we know it, we covered this, but really feel it. No books to casually read, literacy was functional, scrolls were rare and precious. No internet, no streaming services, no video games, no mindless browsing. Your brain, used to constant stimulation, would be screaming for input. The Spartan forms of entertainment, choral song, war dances, athletic contests were all serious, state-sanctioned, and often strenuous. There was no vegging out. Boredom and monotony, while life was harsh for the adult Spartiate, much of it was also highly repetitive. Drills, syssitia, guard duty. Drills, syssitia, guard duty. The lack of variety, the endless sameness of the routine when not at war, could be incredibly soul-crushing for someone used to a more dynamic and choice-filled existence. Insects and pests, flies, mosquitoes, fleas, lice, rodents. Without modern pesticides and sanitation, these would be a constant presence. Imagine trying to sleep on your reed bed while being eaten alive by fleas, or constantly swatting flies away from your meager meal. The weather, the Mediterranean climate, can be lovely, but it can also be brutally hot in summer and surprisingly cold and damp in winter, especially in the Eurotas Valley or the foothills of Taygetus. With only one garment and rudimentary shelter by our standards, you would feel the weather in a way most of us are shielded from. Sunburn, heatstroke, chilblains, frostbite, real possibilities. These little things add up. They create a baseline of discomfort and irritation that would erode your resilience, making the larger challenges even harder to bear. By the end of day 2, you'd be fantasizing about a hot shower, a clean t-shirt, and a cheeseburger with an almost religious fervor. And the absence of these simple things would highlight just how utterly unsuited your pampered modern existence has made you for the raw, uncompromising world of ancient Sparta. A final reflection on your second, failed day. So you've made it through a hypothetical second day. You've encountered the rigid laws and unforgiving governance, the demanding and alien religious practices, the brutal reality of hoplite training, the moral horror of the helot system, the suffocating xenophobia, the harsh realities of health and aging, the terrifying prospect of societal crisis, the maddening communication barriers, the crushing of individuality and progress, and the relentless assault of everyday discomforts. Have you lasted? Or are you, by now, a cowering, bewildered, morally shattered, physically aching, and linguistically incompetent wreck? The Spartan system was a finely tuned machine for producing a very specific type of human being. It was remarkably successful at that for a time, but it was not designed for us. It was not designed for individuals who value comfort, freedom, compassion, as we define it, intellectual curiosity, and personal expression. It's not a criticism of us, nor entirely of them, though we can certainly judge the morality of aspects like the helot system. It's an acknowledgement of difference, a profound, almost unbridgeable chasm of culture, values, and lived experience. Sparta demands a stripping away of everything that makes you in your modern context. It demands you become something else entirely, something harder, colder, more focused, and from our perspective, perhaps something a little less human, or at least human in a way we struggle to fully comprehend or embrace. The legend of Sparta will always fascinate. But the reality, even for a hypothetical 2 days, would likely be your undoing. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson. To understand history is not just to admire its heroes, but to grapple with the often brutal and alien contexts that shape them, and to appreciate with fresh eyes the world we inhabit today. Okay, we've weathered 2 hypothetical, brutal days in the iron grip of ancient Sparta. We've seen how our modern sensibilities, our expectations of comfort, freedom, and even basic human decency as we understand it, would clash violently with the Spartan reality. You're bruised, battered, morally compromised, and teetering on the brink of a complete mental and physical collapse. But the human spirit, or perhaps just sheer narrative necessity, might suggest a sliver of hope. Could you adapt? Could day 3 or day 4 bring some acclimatization, some understanding, some way to navigate this alien landscape? I'm afraid the answer is still a resounding, emphatic no. In fact, the longer you stayed, the more layers of this complex, demanding, and ultimately terrifying society would reveal themselves, each one presenting a fresh and perhaps even more profound reason why you wouldn't last. The initial shock might wear off, only to be replaced by a deeper, more insidious erosion of your very being. Let's embark on this extended, and I assure you, increasingly uncomfortable journey. Part 21. The illusion of equality cracks in the homoioi facade. Spartans called themselves the homoioi, the similars or equals. This was a powerful piece of propaganda, both internal and external. It suggested a brotherhood of citizen soldiers, all sharing the same upbringing, the same duties, the same mess hall, the same commitment to the state. And in many superficial ways, particularly when compared to the vast disparities in other Greek city-states, there was a veneer of truth to it. All Spartiate boys went through the Agoge. All adult men belonged to a syssitia. All were liable for military service. But on your third or fourth day, as the initial sensory overload begins to recede just enough for you to observe more keenly, you'd start to see the cracks in this facade of perfect equality. And these cracks would present new pitfalls for your modern, perhaps naively idealistic, soul. First, wealth. While Lycurgus's reforms aimed to minimize wealth disparities through the kleros system, land allotments, and iron money, differences still existed and, over time, became more pronounced. Not all kleroi were equally fertile or well managed by their helot workforce. Some families were simply older, more prestigious, and had accumulated more influence, if not overtly more liquid assets. You, a newcomer, would have no kleros, no inherited status, no network of powerful kin. Even if magically granted citizenship, you'd be at the bottom of a subtle but very real pecking order. Imagine the syssitia. Yes, everyone contributed a set amount, but some might contribute slightly better wine from their estate or a particularly fine animal for sacrifice and occasional feasting. These wouldn't necessarily buy overt favors, but they would contribute to a man's standing, his reputation. You, with nothing to contribute beyond your bewildered presence, would feel this acutely. Then there was political influence. While all Spartiates could attend the Apella assembly, the real power lay with the Gerousia and the Ephors. Entry into the Gerousia was for life, for men over 60, elected by acclamation. Do you think every 60-year-old had an equal chance? Or did family name, past military glory, and existing connections play a significant role? Of course they did. You, with your modern democratic ideals of one person, one vote having real impact, would find the Apella a frustrating experience. It was largely a reactive body. The real debate and decision-making happened elsewhere, among a select few. Your voice, even if you dared to use it and mastered laconic speech, would likely carry no weight. And what happened if a Spartiate failed to maintain the standards of equality? What if his kleros failed and he couldn't make his syssitia contributions? He didn't just get a friendly loan. He could suffer a loss of rights and status. He could become one of the hypomeans, the inferiors. These were men of Spartiate birth who had, for one reason or another, poverty, cowardice, etc., lost their full citizenship. They lived in a kind of social limbo, a constant reminder of the price of failure. Imagine the shame. In a society built on honor and conformity, to be publicly marked as an inferior would be a living death. You, with your modern safety nets and belief in second chances, would be appalled by this unforgiving system. And if, through your manifest unsuitability, you found yourself on this path to becoming a hypomeans, the psychological burden of that disgrace, in a society that valued reputation above almost all else, would be crushing. Think about battlefield performance. While all were expected to be brave, some were braver, stronger, or more skilled than others. Heroes were celebrated men like King Leonidas. But what about the man who hesitated, who wasn't quite as quick or as lethal? While outright cowardice, the Trisontes, led to utter disgrace, even lesser degrees of perceived inadequacy would affect your standing among your peers. There was a constant, unspoken competition, a need to measure up. Your modern everyone's a winner for participating attitude, it would get you eaten alive. Even within the Agoge, there were hierarchies. Older boys dominated younger ones. More promising youths were singled out for things like the crypteia. This wasn't a system of gentle mentorship. It was often brutal and hierarchical. The illusion of equality was a powerful tool for cohesion, but beneath it lay a complex web of status, influence, and the ever-present threat of shame. You, accustomed to more transparent or at least more fluid social structures, would struggle to navigate these hidden currents. You'd make social gaffes, offend powerful individuals without realizing it, and fail to understand the subtle dance of Spartan honor and reputation. By day 3 or 4, you'd be less an equal, and more an awkward, embarrassing anomaly they didn't quite know what to do with. Part 22. The Spartan Mind Indoctrination vs. Your Inner Rebel. The Agoge, that brutal Spartan upbringing, wasn't just about physical toughness. It was about psychological conditioning on a profound level. Its aim was to sculpt the very mind of a Spartan, to instill not just obedience but a particular way of seeing the world. After a few days, you'd begin to feel the immense pressure of this mental conformity, and your inner modern rebel, your critical thinking, your very sense of independent thought, would be screaming in protest. Consider the inculcation of suspicion. Spartans were wary of outsiders, xenolasia, but this suspicion also permeated their own society to some extent. The constant scrutiny in the Agoge and Sicysha, the fear of Helot revolt, the emphasis on conformity, all this bred a certain watchfulness, a tendency to evaluate everyone for their adherence to Spartan norms. You, likely raised to give people the benefit of thetout, to value open communication, would find this atmosphere stifling. You'd feel constantly watched, judged. Your attempts at genuine, open connection would be met with a reserved, appraising gaze. Could you learn to be that guarded, that suspicious of everyone, even your supposed equals? Emotional stunting. Spartans were masters of emotional suppression. Fear, grief, excessive joy, all were to be controlled. This doesn't mean they didn't feel, but they were conditioned not to show it, and perhaps over time, to even deaden their emotional responses. Imagine living in a society where expressing deep sorrow over a personal loss, beyond a very prescribed brief period, was seen as weakness, or where showing unbridled enthusiasm for something non-martial was considered frivolous. Your modern emotional range, your belief in the importance of expressing and processing feelings, would have no outlet. You'd be forced to bottle everything up, leading to an internal pressure cooker. The lack of critical thought beyond what served the state. The Agoge taught boys what to think, not how to think critically about the foundations of their society. The laws of Lycurgus were sacred. The Spartan way was the best way, period. Questioning fundamental assumptions was not encouraged. It was dangerous. You, a product of an education system that ideally encourages critical inquiry, that exposes you to diverse viewpoints, would be starved for intellectual debate. Your but why? Questions about the Helot system, the role of women, the purpose of the Agoge's brutality, would be met with blank incomprehension or outright hostility. It is the law. It is the way. It makes Sparta strong. End of discussion. Could you switch off that part of your brain that analyzes, questions, seeks deeper understanding? It would be like trying to stop breathing. The intense loyalty to the group. The Agoge and Sicysha forged incredibly strong bonds within specific age cohorts and mess groups. This was vital for phalanx cohesion. But it also meant that your primary loyalty was to this small group, and then to Sparta as a whole, often above even family in the way we understand it. What if your messmates decided on a course of action you found morally questionable, perhaps regarding the treatment of Helots or the bullying of a younger boy? Your modern conscience might compel you to speak out, to dissent. But in Sparta, group cohesion and loyalty were paramount. Breaking ranks, even for moral reasons, could lead to ostracism or worse. You'd face an impossible choice: betray your conscience or betray your comrades. The normalization of brutality. Through the Agoge, through the Crypteia, through the constant military training and the oppression of the Helots, Spartans became desensitized to levels of violence and cruelty that would horrify us. It was simply part of their world, a necessary tool for survival and dominance. You, on day 3 or 4, are still reeling from the initial shock, but the Spartans around you are not shocked. This is their normal. Could you ever accept such a brutal normal? Or would every fresh instance of cruelty you witnessed or were expected to participate in be another nail in the coffin of your ability to adapt? The Spartan mind was a fortress, designed to be impenetrable to doubt, to weakness, to foreign influence. Your modern mind, more open, more questioning, more empathetic by their standards, excessively so, would be seen as a flaw, a bug in the system. The Agoge was designed to erase such flaws, but you're not a child. You're an adult with a fully formed and very different worldview. The attempt to force your mind into the Spartan mold would be a form of psychological torture. You wouldn't just fail to fit in, you'd risk losing yourself in the attempt. Part 23. Art, music, and fun, the Spartan definition. After a few days of unrelenting grimness, your modern soul would be crying out for some levity, some beauty, some form of entertainment that isn't directly related to killing or enduring pain. You might think, surely they had some art, some music, some fun. Yes, they did. But Spartan art, music, and fun were, like everything else, subjugated to the needs of the state and the cultivation of Spartan virtues, and it would offer you little solace. Music and dance, Spartans were known for their choral lyric poetry and martial music. Alcman, a poet who wrote in Sparta in the 7th century BC, composed beautiful Parthenaea songs for choirs of young women. These were performed at religious festivals. They also had war songs and dances like the Pirhich, a mock combat dance performed in armor, demonstrating agility and martial skill. This sounds somewhat promising, right? But understand the context. This music and dance wasn't for individual expression or idle entertainment. It was communal, often religious, and designed to instill discipline, order, and patriotic fervor. The rhythms were often martial. The themes celebrated Spartan gods, heroes, and military ideals. Imagine attending such a performance. It would be impressive, no doubt, but it wouldn't be a rock concert or a night at the opera as you know it. There would be no room for improvisation, for personal interpretation, for the avant-garde. It was about precision, tradition, and reinforcing the collective identity. You, craving something to stir your individual soul, to make you laugh or weep with personal emotion, would find it beautiful perhaps, but ultimately cold and impersonal. Visual arts, Spartan pottery in the archaic period, had its own distinctive style. They also produced bronze figurines and decorative items. But compared to Athens or Corinth, Spartan material culture was deliberately austere. Lycurgus was said to have banned superfluous arts. There were no grand temples rivaling the Parthenon, until much later, and even then more modest, no flurry of life-sized marble statues celebrating individual artists or patrons. Beauty was valued, but it was often a functional beauty, a beauty of well-made arms and armor, of athletic bodies, of disciplined formations. Art for art's sake, art that challenged, art that explored the complexities of the individual human condition, this was largely absent. You, accustomed to a world saturated with diverse visual stimuli, from grand museum art to street art to graphic design, would find the Spartan aesthetic landscape barren. The lack of visual richness, of creative personal expression, would feel like another form of deprivation. Fun and leisure. What did Spartans do for fun when not training, fighting, or participating in state rituals? Hunting was a popular pastime, but again, it was seen as training for war, developing tracking skills, courage, and endurance. Athletic contests were central, but these were serious competitions, not casual games. They had feasts, especially during religious festivals, but even these were within the structured environment of the syssitia or public celebrations, reinforcing communal bonds rather than individual pleasure-seeking. There was no equivalent of going to a comedy club, seeing a play that wasn't a state-sanctioned religious performance, reading a novel, or engaging in witty philosophical banter in a symposium, as in Athens. Laughter, yes, Spartans had a sense of humor, that dry, laconic wit, but it was often at someone else's expense, a tool for social control, for puncturing pomposity or weakness. It wasn't the easy, unrestrained laughter of pure amusement. Storytelling, they had their myths, their legends of Heracles, their claimed ancestor, the Dioscoroi, Castor, and Polydeuces, Spartan heroes, and their own historical figures like Lycurgus and Leonidas. These stories reinforced Spartan values: courage, discipline, sacrifice, obedience. There was no room for narratives that questioned these values, that explored ambiguity, or that celebrated the anti-hero. You, with your love of complex characters, morally gray narratives, and stories that challenge your perspective, would find Spartan storytelling one-dimensional and propagandistic. By day 3 or 4, your need for genuine, personal, non-functional creative expression and unstructured fun would be acute. You'd be starved for beauty that wasn't weaponized, for music that wasn't a march, for laughter that wasn't a reprimand. The Spartan definition of culture and leisure would feel like yet another set of chains, another way in which your modern spirit was being starved and suppressed. You'd realize that even in their downtime, Spartans were never truly off-duty. Part 24, Gods, Omens, and the Weight of Piety, Day 3, at a festival. Let's say that on your 3rd day in Sparta, It's the middle of the Carnea, the great 9-day festival sacred to Apollo Karneos, a god of herds, harvest, and prophecy, deeply connected to the military well-being of Sparta. This wasn't optional. Your participation and the sincerity of that participation would be under scrutiny. And for you, the modern unbeliever or believer in a different paradigm, it would be a minefield of potential sacrilege. The preparation, days before, there would have been purification rituals. You, clueless, would have missed them or performed them incorrectly. The atmosphere in Sparta would be different, a mix of solemnity and anticipation. Certain activities, like warfare, were forbidden. This might seem like a relief, but the religious obligations would be intense. The processions and sacrifices, the festival involved elaborate processions. Imagine being herded into a specific place in a marching column, expected to maintain a certain demeanor, perhaps carry a ritual object you don't understand. Any awkwardness, any fumbling would be noted. Then the sacrifices. Animals, likely goats or rams, would be ritually slaughtered at the altar of Apollo. The smoke, the blood, the smell, the chanting of priests, it would be a visceral, sensory experience. You, perhaps a vegetarian or simply unused to public animal sacrifice, might feel revulsion, faintness. Showing such weakness would be deeply inappropriate. You'd be expected to watch with reverence, to partake in the communal sharing of the sacrificial meat later, believing it imbued with divine blessing. Could you stomach it, literally and figuratively? The Agon contest. The Carnea often included musical contests, particularly playing the kithara, a type of lyre, and singing hymns to Apollo. These weren't amateur talent shows. The performers were highly skilled, the standards exacting. Even as a spectator, your attentiveness, your appreciation, your understanding of the complex Doric meters and modes would be implicitly judged. If you looked bored or confused, or heaven forbid whispered a comment to your neighbor during a sacred hymn, you'd be an object of scorn. The Staphylodromoi grape cluster runners. A peculiar ritual of the Carnea involved 5 unmarried young men, the Carnitai, chosen for 5 years of service to the god, chasing a man adorned with garlands. If they caught him, it was a good omen for the city. If not, it was a bad one. Imagine the pressure on these participants. And as an observer, you'd be expected to understand the deep significance of this seemingly strange chase, to feel the collective anxiety and hope riding on its outcome. Your likely bewilderment, why are they chasing that flowery guy, would mark you as an ignorant outsider. Divination and omens. Apollo was a god of prophecy. Throughout the Carnea, priests and seers would be observing omens, interpreting signs, perhaps delivering oracles. The fate of Sparta, its harvests, its military campaigns were seen to hang in the balance. The air would be thick with religious anxiety and the need for divine reassurance. You, with your modern rationalism, might struggle to take this seriously. You might see it as superstition. But to the Spartans, it was deadly serious. Any skepticism, even if only visible in a flicker of your eyes or a subtle shift in your posture, could be interpreted as impiety, as endangering the community by inviting divine displeasure. The communal feasting, sacrificial meat would be distributed and eaten in a communal setting, probably still within the Syssitia framework, but with a more festive, though still ordered, atmosphere. You'd be expected to eat your share, to participate in the prescribed toasts and paeans, songs of praise or thanksgiving. Your earlier aversion to Spartan food would now be compounded by the religious significance. Refusing to eat or eating without the proper show of reverence would be a grave offense. The duration, 9 days. 9 days of intense religious observance, of prescribed behaviors, of public scrutiny, of constant pressure to demonstrate piety you don't feel. By the end of day 3 of the Carnea, your 5th hypothetical day in Sparta overall, you wouldn't just be tired. You'd be spiritually exhausted from the constant performance, terrified of making a mistake, and utterly alienated by a worldview that saw divine intervention in every gust of wind and every bird's flight. Your attempts to go through the motions would be transparently false. You'd be a discordant note in their sacred symphony, and they would notice. Part 25. Foreign Affairs. The Spartan gaze outward. Sparta was not an isolated island, despite its xenophobic tendencies. It was a major power in the Greek world, the leader of the Peloponnesian League, and frequently engaged in diplomacy and warfare with other city-states. How would you, a modern individual, fair if thrust into any interaction involving Sparta's foreign policy, probably disastrously. The Xenalasia mindset, revisited, we know Spartans periodically expelled foreigners. This wasn't just about keeping out spies or luxuries. It was about maintaining Spartan ideological purity. Their system was so unique, so demanding, that it was inherently vulnerable to comparison. If young Spartans saw Athenians living freely, debating philosophy, enjoying art, they might start asking dangerous questions. Imagine you are with a group of Spartans when they encounter a trader from Corinth or a traveler from distant Ionia. The immediate Spartan reaction would be suspicion, disdain, or at best, a curt dismissal. Your modern instinct might be curiosity, a desire to exchange information, to learn about their culture. This openness would be seen as a shocking naivety, a failure to recognize the inherent superiority of the Spartan way and the potential threat posed by foreign influence. Why are you talking to that foreigner with such interest? Have you forgotten who you are? Diplomacy, Spartan style. When Spartans engaged in diplomacy, it was often blunt to the point and backed by the implicit or explicit threat of their military might. The famous laconic messages, if, were not just witty. They were expressions of power and an unwillingness to engage in lengthy, Athens-style rhetorical debates. Imagine you are part of a Spartan embassy to another Greek state, a highly improbable scenario for you, but let's speculate. Your modern diplomatic toolkit: compromise, finding common ground, empathetic listening, nuanced language would be utterly useless, and in fact counterproductive. You'd be expected to present Sparta's demands or positions with unyielding firmness. Any attempt to soften the message, to show flexibility, would be seen as weakness, as betraying Sparta's interests. You'd likely cause a diplomatic incident by either being too soft or by failing to project the necessary Spartan arrogance. Dealing with allies: Peloponnesian League. Sparta led the Peloponnesian League, an alliance of city-states, but their leadership was often heavy-handed and resented. They expected obedience and military contributions from their allies, but offered little in terms of democratic consultation. If you were a Spartan interacting with representatives from Corinth or Thebes, you'd be expected to assert Spartan dominance. Your modern belief in alliances as partnerships of equals would be out of place. You'd be expected to command, not to persuade or negotiate in good faith. Your attempts at building genuine rapport would be seen as undermining Spartan authority. Understanding the enemy: Spartan understanding of their main rival, Athens, was often simplistic. They saw Athenians as soft, undisciplined, talkative, and unreliable, the antithesis of themselves. While there was a grudging respect for Athenian naval power and resilience, there was little attempt to understand the complexities of Athenian democracy or culture on its own terms. It was all viewed through the lens of Spartan superiority. You, with a more nuanced historical understanding, might try to explain Athenian motivations or strengths in a more balanced way. This would likely be dismissed as Athenian sympathies or a failure to grasp the fundamental rottenness of their enemy. The information bubble: Spartans controlled the flow of information. News from the outside world was filtered. Travel was restricted. This created an echo chamber where Spartan values and Spartan interpretations of events were constantly reinforced. You, accustomed to a 24/7 global news cycle and a multitude of perspectives, would feel intellectually starved and manipulated. Your attempts to introduce outside information or alternative viewpoints would be met with suspicion or outright censorship. By your third or fourth day, any interaction with the world beyond Laconia's borders, or even discussions about it, would highlight your profound un-Spartan-ness. Your globalized, multicultural, information-rich modern mindset would be a direct threat to Spartan insularity and self-belief. You wouldn't just fail at Spartan diplomacy. You'd be a walking, talking embodiment of the foreign contamination they so feared. Part 26, the Helot question: a deeper dive into your complicity. We've acknowledged the horror of the Helot system. But after a few days, the initial shock wouldn't be enough. You'd be forced into a position of ongoing, daily complicity, and the psychological toll of this, for a modern person with a developed conscience, would become unbearable. This isn't just about witnessing brutality, it's about your role in perpetuating it. The daily grind of oppression, your kleros, your land allotment, is worked by helots, They are your helots in a sense, though ultimately state property. Their labor feeds you, clothes you indirectly, and allows you the leisure to be a full-time warrior. You are not just a passive beneficiary, you are an active part of the machinery of their enslavement. On day 3, 4, 5, you'd be expected to interact with them, or at least oversee their work. How? With orders, with demands, with the constant assertion of your authority. The Spartans around you would be doing this as a matter of course, with a harshness and detachment that would chill you to the bone. Could you do it? Could you look a helot family in the eyes, people who have tilled this land for generations, who have their own hopes, fears, and hidden resentments, and treat them as mere tools, as less than human? Every word of command you uttered would feel like a betrayal of your own moral compass. The fear is two-sided. We've spoken of the Spartans' fear of helot revolt. But imagine the helots' fear of you. They would be watching you, trying to gauge your temperament. Are you like the other masters, quick to anger, ready with a blow, or are you hesitant, uncertain, which they might interpret as weakness or a trick? Your modern instinct might be to try and be kind, or at least fair, by your standards. But as we've discussed, this kindness could be dangerous for them and for you. It could be misinterpreted by other Spartans as undermining the system, or by the helots as a sign that you are an easy mark. There is no good way to be a master in an unjust system. The crypteia, an order you can't refuse, imagine, as a younger Spartiate deemed promising, or perhaps needing to be blooded, you are selected for the crypteia. You are given a dagger and told to go out into the countryside, to live off the land, and to kill any helot who seems strong, intelligent, or potentially rebellious. This isn't a hypothetical discussion anymore. This is an order. From the Ephors, perhaps, refusal is not an option. What would you do? Your entire modern being would recoil in horror. Could you sneak up on an unsuspecting farmer, someone who has done you no personal harm, and murder him in cold blood simply because the state commands it? The alternative, refusing the order, would mean an immediate and brutal end to your Spartan career, and possibly your life. This is the sharpest point of the moral spear, and even if you aren't chosen for the crypteia, you know it exists. You benefit from its terror, you are complicit in its existence. The dehumanization process. To survive psychologically as an oppressor, you must dehumanize the oppressed. Spartans did this through ritual humiliation of helots, through propaganda, through the constant reinforcement of their own superiority. You would be expected to participate in this, at least tacitly. To laugh when helots were forced to act foolishly, to use derogatory terms, to internalize the belief that they are inherently inferior and deserving of their fate. Could your modern mind, steeped in ideals of universal human dignity, undergo this transformation? Or would the cognitive dissonance tear you apart? Every day you spent in Sparta would be a day spent either succumbing to this moral corrosion or living in a state of silent, internal agony. The fruits of their labor, every meal you eat at the Syssitia, every garment you wear, every weapon you carry, all of it is made possible by the stolen labor and suppressed lives of the helots. This realization, once it truly sinks in beyond the initial shock, would taint everything. Your modern awareness of exploitation, of social justice, would make it impossible to enjoy any aspect of Spartan life without the bitter taste of this foundational injustice. You wouldn't just be uncomfortable, you'd be sickened by your own dependence on a system of brutal exploitation. By the end of your first week, the helot question would have moved from an external horror to an internal crisis. You are not just an observer of oppression, you are a participant, a beneficiary, an enforcer. This daily, grinding reality would be more destructive to your modern soul than any physical beating in the Agoge. You would either break or become something you would no longer recognize. Part 27, The Long Game: Sickness, Old Age, and the End of Usefulness, revisited with a grim outlook. Let's imagine, against all odds, you've somehow survived a few weeks, a few months. You're a physical and psychological wreck, but you're still breathing. Now, the longer-term realities of Spartan life, especially regarding health and aging, begin to loom with even more terrifying clarity. Theirs was not a society with much patience for prolonged weakness. The inevitability of decline, no matter how Spartan you try to be, your modern body is not conditioned for decades of this abuse. Chronic injuries from training, malnutrition, by our standards of balanced diet, the constant stress, it will take its toll. What happens when you can no longer keep up in training? When your spear arm trembles, when your shield feels impossibly heavy, when you're consistently the last and weakest in drills. In Sparta, there was no light duty for aging warriors in their prime. You were either a frontline hoplite or you were becoming a problem. The fear of becoming a burden, unlike modern societies with healthcare systems, pensions, and social support for the elderly or infirm, Sparta was geared towards producing and maintaining warriors. An ex-warrior who could no longer fight, who was not yet old enough or esteemed enough for the Gerousia, occupied a precarious position. The Syssitia contributions were still due. If you couldn't manage your kleros effectively due to illness or infirmity and thus couldn't contribute, you faced the shame of becoming a hypomaeans. There was no social security. Your family might support you, but it would be within a system that valued strength and contribution above all. The psychological pressure of feeling yourself becoming a burden in such a society would be immense. Your modern expectation that society has a duty of care towards its sick and elderly would find no purchase. The Gerousia, a distant hope, yes, men over 60 could be elected to the Gerousia. This was a position of immense honor and influence, but not everyone made it, and 60 was a ripe old age in the ancient world, especially for men who had lived such a hard physical life. Many would have died in battle or from disease long before. And what if you reached 60 but were not deemed Gerousia material? What if you hadn't distinguished yourself enough, or your family lacked the necessary clout? You'd be an old man in a society that revered the idea of wise elders, but had little practical use for an old warrior who was merely old. The Spartan retirement plan, there wasn't one in our sense. Your value was tied to your utility to the state. When that utility waned significantly, so did your status and security unless you transitioned into a respected elder role. For those who didn't, life could become increasingly marginal. Plutarch tells stories of older Spartans still trying to participate in exercises, keen to show they weren't finished. There was a desperate desire to remain relevant, to not be seen as soft, even in old age. This wasn't just pride, it was a survival mechanism in a society that had little room for the unproductive. Your modern health expectations vs. Spartan reality. Imagine developing a chronic illness, arthritis, failing eyesight, heart problems. In the modern world, you'd manage it with medication, lifestyle adjustments, medical support. In Sparta, these conditions would be a death knell to your active life. There were no miracle drugs, no sophisticated surgeries. You'd be expected to endure it stoically, but your ability to function as a Spartan would be fatally compromised. The mental anguish of facing such a decline, without the medical and social supports we take for granted, and in a society that prizes physical perfection, would be devastating. Your modern knowledge of what could be done for your condition would only make the Spartan reality more unbearable. The good death, Spartans glorified death in battle, returning with your shield or on it. What about dying of old age or sickness in your reed bed? While not shameful in the same way as cowardice, it lacked the kleos glory of a warrior's demise. There was an implicit understanding that a true Spartan's life was best expended in service to the state, preferably on the battlefield. This constant pressure, even in sickness and old age, to somehow embody Spartan virtues, to not complain, to not be a burden, would be a relentless psychological grind. You'd feel a profound loneliness, a sense that your individual suffering was an inconvenience to the collective. The longer you hypothetically lasted in Sparta, the more these grim, long-term realities would close in. The Spartan system was designed for peak performers in their prime. It had little patience or provision for the inevitable decline that awaits all human bodies. Your modern expectation of dignity and care in sickness and old age would be met with a cold, hard indifference, or worse, contempt for your failing utility. Part 28. Why even a week is a fantasy, the utter unraveling of the modern soul. We've pushed this thought experiment far beyond the initial day. We've imagined you, somehow, clinging on for a week, perhaps more. But let's be honest, each passing hour in Sparta would be an accumulation of physical pain, psychological torment, moral compromise, and profound cultural alienation. The modern soul, your soul, is simply not wired for this. Think of it as a system overload, physical overload. Your body, unconditioned from birth, would be breaking down. Malnutrition, exhaustion, untreated injuries, constant discomfort. You'd be in a perpetual state of physical distress. Emotional overload. the demand for stoicism, the suppression of fear, grief, and even joy unless state-sanctioned, would lead to an internal explosion or implosion. Your empathy, a modern virtue, would be a source of constant pain in the face of Spartan brutality. Moral overload, complicity in the helot system, participation in or witnessing the Agoge's cruelty, the expectation to kill without question your moral compass would be shattered. The cognitive dissonance would become unbearable. Intellectual overload or underload, the lack of critical inquiry, the absence of diverse ideas, the state-controlled culture. The xenophobia your mind, accustomed to freedom and stimulation, would be starved and suffocated. Social overload, the constant scrutiny, the rigid hierarchies masked as equality, the complex and unspoken social codes, the demand for absolute conformity, the lack of privacy. You'd be perpetually on edge, making mistakes, feeling isolated even when surrounded. Existential overload, the Spartan worldview where the state is everything and the individual is nothing, where life is cheap and glory in death is the highest aspiration, where progress is suspect and tradition is absolute, is so fundamentally opposed to most modern Western values that you would experience a profound crisis of meaning and purpose. What would breaking look like? Perhaps a complete physical collapse. You simply can't get up one morning. Perhaps a public emotional outburst, weeping, raging, begging for mercy or understanding, which would be met with contempt and punishment. Perhaps a desperate act of rebellion, a futile attempt to assert your individuality or protest an injustice, which would be swiftly and brutally crushed. Perhaps a descent into a catatonic state, your mind shutting down to protect itself from the overwhelming horror. Or perhaps, most insidiously, you would start to adapt. You'd start to suppress your empathy, to parrot the slogans, to accept the brutality, to become a shadow of your former self, a hollowed-out imitation of a Spartan. And that, for a modern soul, might be the most terrifying failure of all, to lose not just your life, but your very humanity as you understand it. The Spartans were a product of a unique and savage crucible. They were what their world demanded them to be. We are products of a radically different world, one that, for all its flaws, has afforded us luxuries of body, mind, and spirit that would be utterly incomprehensible to a citizen of ancient Lacedaemon. To ask if you would last a day, a week, a month in Sparta is not to test your courage or resilience by some universal standard. It is to highlight the almost unfathomable gulf between their reality and ours. They were a testament to human adaptability in one direction. Our inability to survive in their world is a testament to how far our own societal values have, thankfully, in many respects diverged. So no, you wouldn't last, not because you are weak, but because you are modern. Because you carry within you the legacy of centuries of thought, social change, and moral evolution that make the Spartan way not just alien, but anathema. Be grateful for that. Be grateful for your comforts, your freedoms, your complexities, your right to be an individual. Because in the stark, unforgiving light of ancient Sparta, those are the very things that would ensure your swift and certain demise. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate, chilling lesson of this journey into their world. It's a world that demands a price no modern soul should ever have to pay.